Otto von Bismarck opened the conference with a speech about civilization, free trade, and the improvement of Africa. The language was polite, even noble, but the goal was clear: divide Africa. Over the next 3 months, the delegates would meet regularly, drafting agreements, negotiating boundaries, and establishing the rules of colonization. The Berlin Conference produced several key agreements that would define the colonization of Africa. Let's break them down. 1. The principle of effective occupation. This was the most important rule. It stated that for a European power to claim African territory, it had to demonstrate effective occupation, meaning it had to establish a physical presence. Simply drawing a line on a map wasn't enough. You needed soldiers, administrators, or settlers on the ground. This rule was designed to prevent empty claims, but in practice, it triggered a race. European powers scrambled to send expeditions into the African interior to plant flags and establish forts before their rivals could. 2. Freedom of navigation on African rivers. The conference declared that the Congo River and the Niger River were to be free and open for trade by all nations. This sounds reasonable, but it had a dark purpose. It allowed European merchants and militaries to travel deep into Africa's interior, bypassing African control over trade routes. For African kingdoms that had grown wealthy by controlling river trade, this was devastating. The rules of the game had changed without their input. 3. Recognition of the Congo Free State. This was King Leopold II's great victory. The conference officially recognized the Congo Free State, not as a colony of Belgium, but as Leopold's personal property. Leopold had spent years lobbying European governments, presenting himself as a humanitarian who wanted to abolish the slave trade and bring Christianity to Africa. He hired the famous explorer Henry Morton Stanley to establish outposts in the Congo Basin and make treaties with local chiefs, treaties that the chiefs often didn't understand or were coerced into signing. In Berlin, Leopold's efforts paid off. The European powers agreed to recognize his control over the Congo. It was a decision that would lead to one of the greatest atrocities in human history. We'll return to that later. 4. The partition of East Africa Germany secured control over present-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, areas that would become German East Africa. Britain secured Kenya and Uganda, as well as influence over Zanzibar. Italy was granted parts of Somalia and the coastline of Eritrea, though they would later suffer a humiliating defeat when they tried to conquer Ethiopia. 5. The division of West Africa France claimed a massive swath of West Africa, present-day Senegal, Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, Guinea, and much of the Sahel. Britain took the Gold Coast, Ghana, Nigeria, and Sierra Leone. Germany claimed Togo and Cameroon. Portugal held on to small territories in Guinea-Bissau and parts of Angola. 6. Southern Africa. Britain already controlled the Cape Colony in South Africa, but they wanted more. Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and imperialist, dreamed of a British empire from Cape to Cairo. The Berlin Conference helped legitimize British expansion into present-day Zimbabwe, Rhodesia, named after Rhodes, Zambia, and Botswana. Portugal maintained control over Angola and Mozambique, though Britain and Germany tried to limit Portuguese expansion. On February 26, 1885, after 3 months of negotiations, the delegates signed the General Act of the Berlin Conference. It was a document of 38 articles that codified the agreements made during the conference. The General Act established the rules of colonization. It recognized European claims across Africa. It divided the continent into spheres of influence. And it did all of this without a single African signature. The conference was over. The carving of Africa had begun. The Berlin Conference didn't create colonies overnight. What it did was provide a legal framework, a set of rules that European powers agreed to follow. Now the real work began: conquest. Over the next 20 years, European nations launched military expeditions into Africa to enforce the borders drawn in Berlin. African kingdoms resisted fiercely. The Ashanti fought the British in multiple wars. The Zulu resisted. Samurai Tura held off the French for nearly 2 decades. The Herero and Nama people in German Southwest Africa, Namibia, waged guerrilla warfare against German forces. The Maji Maji rebellion in German East Africa saw tens of thousands of Africans rise up against colonial rule. But the technological gap was overwhelming. European armies had machine guns, artillery, and steamships. African armies, no matter how brave or disciplined, were at a disadvantage. One by one, African kingdoms fell. By 1914, nearly 90% of Africa was under European control. Only Ethiopia and Liberia remained independent. One of the biggest lies of the Berlin Conference was that colonization was about helping Africa. European leaders spoke endlessly about the civilizing mission, the idea that they were bringing progress, education, Christianity, and modern infrastructure to backward societies. But this was propaganda. The truth is that colonization was about extraction. Europe wanted Africa's resources: rubber, ivory, gold, diamonds, copper, palm oil, and they were willing to use violence to get them. The civilizing mission was a cover story. Yes, some missionaries built schools and hospitals, but those institutions served the colonial system. Schools taught Africans to speak European languages and to see European culture as superior. Hospitals treated workers so they could continue laboring in mines and plantations. Infrastructure, railways, roads, ports wasn't built for Africans. It was built to move resources from the interior to the coast where they could be shipped to Europe. We need to talk about King Leopold II and the Congo. When the Berlin Conference recognized Leopold's control over the Congo, the European powers believed his promises. He said he wanted to abolish the slave trade, bring Christianity, and promote free trade. It was all a lie. What Leopold created in the Congo was a nightmare. The Congo Free State became his personal rubber plantation. Leopold never set foot in the Congo, but he ruled it from Brussels through a network of brutal enforcers. Africans were forced to collect rubber from wild vines in the jungle. If they didn't meet their quotas, they were punished, whipped, mutilated, or killed. Villages that resisted were burned. Hostages were taken to force compliance. One of the most horrifying practices was the cutting off of hands. Belgian officers would cut off the hands of Africans, men, women, children, as proof that they had used bullets to punish resistors rather than wasting ammunition on hunting. Estimates vary, but historians believe that between 1885 and 1908, approximately 10 million Congolese people died due to violence, starvation, disease, and forced labor under Leopold's rule. It was one of the deadliest genocides in history, and it all started with a handshake at the Berlin Conference. Eventually, international outrage forced Belgium to take control of the Congo away from Leopold in 1908. But the damage was done. The Congo would never fully recover. One of the most destructive legacies of the Berlin Conference is the borders. When European diplomats drew lines on maps in Berlin, they didn't care about African realities. They didn't care about ethnic groups, languages, or kingdoms. They cared about rivers, resources, and strategic locations. As a result, colonial borders cut straight through communities. The Somali people were divided between British Somaliland, Italian Somaliland, French Somaliland, and Ethiopia. The Maasai people were split between British Kenya and German East Africa, later Tanzania. The Yoruba and the Hausa peoples were divided between British Nigeria and French colonies. Families were separated, trade networks were disrupted, kingdoms were split in half. And in some cases, European powers deliberately grouped rival ethnic groups into the same colony, creating divisions that could be exploited to maintain control. This strategy is called divide and rule, and it worked. By pitting African groups against each other, colonial powers could prevent unified resistance. These artificial borders still exist today, and they are the root cause of many modern conflicts, from the Rwandan genocide to the ongoing instability in the Democratic Republic of Congo, South Sudan, and Somalia. Here's something you won't hear in most history books. Africans fought back. The narrative that Africa was passively colonized is a lie. Across the continent, Africans resisted militarily, politically, and culturally. Ethiopia. In 1896, Emperor Menelik II led Ethiopian forces to a stunning victory over Italy at the Battle of Adwa. It was the only time an African nation decisively defeated a European colonial army. Ethiopia remained independent, and Adwa became a symbol of African resistance worldwide. The Zulu Kingdom. Even after defeat, Zulu resistance continued for years. The British had to use overwhelming force and divide and conquer tactics to suppress Zulu power. Samurai Ture. In West Africa, Samurai Ture waged a brilliant guerrilla campaign against the French for nearly 20 years. He used hit-and-run tactics, retreated when necessary, and built a new empire every time the French destroyed the old one. He was finally captured in 1898, but he remains a hero in West African history. The Maji Maji Rebellion in 1905 to 1907. In German East Africa, diverse ethnic groups united against German rule. They believed that a sacred water, Meiji, would protect them from bullets. It didn't, but the rebellion showed the power of African unity and resistance. These stories are often ignored, but they matter. They show that Africans were not passive victims. They were fighters, strategists, and leaders who refused to accept colonization without a fight. By 1914, the map of Africa had been completely redrawn. The continent was divided into colonies, protectorates, and spheres of influence, and the impact was immediate and devastating. African economies were restructured to serve European interests. Instead of producing goods for local consumption or regional trade, Africans were forced to grow cash crops, cotton, cocoa, coffee, peanuts, for export to Europe.